Jason Calloway was driving home late at night, the rain falling heavily on the road. His car's headlights cut through the misty air. But everything around him looked dark and blurry. He was tired. It had been a long day at work, and all he wanted was to get home. Suddenly, a deer jumped onto the road in front of him. Jason turned the wheel quickly to avoid it. The car slid on the wet road, then crashed through the guardrail and into the trees. When Jason woke up, he was in a hospital bed. The bright lights hurt his eyes, and his body felt sore all over. A nurse stood next to him. Her voice soft but unclear, as if she was far away. Jason tried to focus, but his head hurt, and he felt confused. "What's your name?" the nurse asked. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't know the answer. His mind was blank. He looked around, panic rising in his chest. I don't know," he said quietly, his voice shaking. The nurse looked worried and glanced at the doctor. Jason felt his heart race. He couldn't remember who he was, where he was, or what had happened to him. His whole life had disappeared from his mind, leaving him alone and scared. After a few days in the hospital, Jason was allowed to go home. But home didn't feel like home. His apartment looked clean and organized. But it was like walking into a stranger's life. He didn't recognize the furniture, the pictures on the walls, or the clothes in his closet. Everything was unfamiliar. His phone was full of messages from people, friends, coworkers, and even a woman named Emily, who said she was his ex-girlfriend. Jason tried talking to them, but it felt strange. They knew things about him, things that he couldn't remember. When they spoke about shared memories, Jason could only smile politely, pretending he understood, but inside, he felt lost. The doctors had told him that he had dissociative amnesia, a type of memory loss caused by the trauma of the accident. They said his memories might return slowly, or maybe not at all. Jason didn't know which was worse, the fear that he might never remember his past, or the idea that he might remember something he didn't want to face. Sometimes he would get small flashes of memories. A woman's face, smiling at him by the ocean. The sound of laughter. The smell of salty air. But the images would fade quickly, like trying to hold water in his hands. One day, while cleaning his apartment, Jason found an old journal. Inside, there were short, confusing entries. The writing was his. But it felt distant, like someone else had written them. The journal mentioned someone named Kate, but the details were unclear. Jason felt like this could be a clue, something important about his past, but he didn't understand the connection. As the days passed, Jason felt more and more frustrated. He wanted to know who he was, but every time he tried to dig deeper, he hit a wall. The life he was supposed to be living, his job, his friends, his old routines, didn't feel real to him. It was like playing a role in a story he didn't belong to. And then, there were the memories of the woman by the ocean. Who was she? Why did she feel so important? Jason knew that if he wanted to find himself again, he had to follow the few clues he had. Jason's life felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Every day, he hoped for something to trigger his memory, but nothing worked. Then one afternoon, while going through old boxes in his apartment, he found something, a small, faded photograph. In it, he was standing by the ocean with a woman. She was smiling at him, her arm around his shoulders. Jason stared at the picture, his heart racing. The woman looked familiar. She was the one from his flashes of memory. Was this Kate? Feeling a pull he couldn't explain, Jason decided to visit the coast. He remembered the ocean from his brief flashes. And something about the water felt important. Maybe going there would help him remember more. He drove to a small coastal town, about 2 hours away from his apartment. As he walked along the rocky beach, the smell of salt and the sound of waves crashing against the shore gave him a strange sense of déjà vu. It was as if he had been there before, but he couldn't quite grasp the memory. Jason began asking around, showing the photo to some of the locals. A few older people recognized him. One man, working at a small cafe, told Jason that he used to visit this town every summer as a child with his family. The man also remembered Kate. She was Jason's childhood friend, always by his side whenever they visited. This information was a shock. Jason hadn't even known he had been to this town, let alone spent summers there. He felt closer to understanding his past but still didn't know the full story. As Jason continued exploring the town, he found an old, abandoned beach house on a cliff. The moment he saw it, something deep inside stirred. The house had once belonged to his family. He stepped inside, finding the rooms covered in dust, but there were signs of the life they had once lived: old photos, furniture, and childhood toys. In the corner of the living room, he found another picture of himself with Kate, standing on the same beach. Jason began to realize that this place, and Kate, held a key to his missing memories. But there was something about the way people spoke about Kate that made Jason uneasy, as if something terrible had happened. The more he searched, the more he felt like he was getting closer to a dark truth, one that might explain why he had forgotten so much. He just wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened here, something that made him forget who he was. With the clues from the old beach house and the locals, he started digging deeper into the past. One day, Jason visited the town's small library, hoping to find more about his family's history in the area. The librarian, an elderly woman, remembered him and his family. She looked at Jason with a mixture of sympathy and sadness. Hesitantly, she mentioned an accident that happened years ago, a tragedy involving a young woman named Kate. Jason's heart sank. He had a feeling this was the answer he had been looking for, but he wasn't ready to hear it. The librarian told him that when Jason was a teenager, he and Kate had gone out on a boat one summer afternoon. The weather had changed suddenly, and they were caught in a storm. Kate drowned that day, and Jason was the only one who survived. Hearing this, Jason felt like he had been hit by a wave of emotions: grief, guilt, and confusion. He couldn't remember any of it. But it explained so much. The flashes of memory, the woman by the ocean, the feeling of loss, were all tied to that day. His mind had blocked it out to protect him from the pain. Determined to learn more, Jason drove to the cliffs where the accident had happened. As he stood there, looking out over the crashing waves, more pieces of the past began to surface. He remembered being on the boat, the wind picking up, Kate's voice calling his name, and the moment she slipped beneath the water. It all felt distant, like watching someone else's life, but it was his. Back at the abandoned beach house, Jason found an old letter hidden in a drawer, written by his younger self. In the letter, he had written about the accident, but also about the guilt that had haunted him. He had blamed himself for what happened, convinced that he could have saved Kate if he had been stronger, faster. This guilt had weighed on him for years, and over time, he had buried the memory, trying to escape the pain. The journal he had found earlier made sense now. Jason realized he had been struggling with these memories long before the car crash, and the accident had only made things worse. His mind had decided to erase everything, not just Kate, but his entire identity, to protect him from the overwhelming guilt and grief. But now, standing at the edge of the cliffs, Jason knew he couldn't run from it anymore. He had to face the truth about what had happened to Kate, and in doing so, he could finally begin to understand himself again. Standing at the cliffs where the accident had taken place, Jason felt the weight of his past crashing down on him, just like the waves below. He now knew what he had been running from for so long, Kate's death. The memories of that day had been too painful for him to face, so his mind had pushed them away, locking them behind a wall of forgetfulness. But now, the wall was crumbling, and there was no turning back. Jason sat on the edge of the cliff, staring out at the ocean. The salty breeze stung his eyes, but it also brought a strange sense of peace. He let the memories come, no longer trying to block them out. He remembered the sound of Kate's laughter as they pushed the boat into the water that day, the way the sky had darkened suddenly, and the panic in his chest when the storm hit. He could see her face clearly now, the moment when she slipped beneath the waves, and the helplessness that followed. A part of him still wanted to believe that he could have saved her, that he should have done more. But deep down, Jason realized that it wasn't his fault. The storm had been too strong, the ocean too powerful. He had done everything he could. The guilt he had been carrying all these years had been weighing him down, stopping him from living his life. It was time to let it go. Jason closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry. He cried for Kate, for the life they never had, and for the years he had spent trying to forget her. But as the tears fell, they brought relief. It was as if a heavy burden was being lifted from his chest. Later that day, Jason visited Kate's grave, something he hadn't done in years. He knelt down, placing a small bouquet of flowers on the grass. He didn't say anything at first, just letting the silence speak. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Kate. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." As he stood up to leave, Jason felt lighter. He knew he wasn't fully healed yet, and maybe he never would be, but he had finally confronted the darkest part of his past. And in doing so, he could start to rebuild his future. He didn't need to remember every detail of his life before the accident. What mattered now was that he was ready to move forward. After confronting the truth about Kate, Jason felt like a different person. The weight he had been carrying for so many years, the guilt that had shaped his life, was starting to lift. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next. For the first time in a long while, he felt ready to start over. Back in Seattle, Jason made some big decisions. He quit his high-pressure job at the tech firm. The job had always been a distraction, a way to keep himself busy so he wouldn't have to think about the things that really mattered. Now, he wanted to do something more meaningful, something that made a difference. He reached out to a local nonprofit that helped people struggling with trauma and memory loss. Sharing his own story with them, he decided to work with them, using his experiences to help others find their way. Jason also reconnected with Emily, his ex-girlfriend. Their first conversation after his accident had been awkward, but now things were different. He opened up to her, telling her everything about his journey to remember, the pain of losing Kate, and the way it had shaped his life. Emily listened, and for the first time, Jason didn't feel the need to hide behind a mask. He wasn't sure where things would go with her, but for now, they were rebuilding their friendship, slowly and honestly. With time, Jason's nightmares about Kate became less frequent. Instead of drowning in guilt, he remembered the good moments they had shared, their summers by the ocean, the laughter, the sense of adventure. These memories didn't hurt as much anymore. They were still bittersweet, but now they felt like a part of him that he could cherish, not something to run from. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Jason returned to the cliffs where he had last been with Kate. This time, he wasn't searching for answers or haunted by guilt. He stood at the edge of the water, watching the waves roll in, feeling at peace. He had come to terms with the fact that he might never remember every detail of his life before the accident. But he didn't need to. He knew who he was now, A man who had faced his past and found a way to move forward. In the final scene, Jason walks down the beach, the sun setting behind him. As the light fades into the horizon, he feels a sense of calm. He has made peace with the echoes of his past and is ready for whatever comes next. His journey isn't over, but he's no longer afraid of where it will lead. The end.